Welcome back to the Hidden History Happy Hour. Now, you might have noticed my opening is a little bit more subdued than usual. And you might be asking, is Brian ill? Is he down in the dumpsies? No. It's just in London, I was a little too boisterous. And also, I had to do it twice. So, just taking it down a notch. Alex, how are you? Welcome back.
Thank you. Good to see you, my friend. I have a cold. So, for the first time in our podcast, I'm having Lemsip. I don't know if you have Lemsip in the US, but it's like a cold cure.
Oh, well, there's no vodka in there or anything, though. Right?
There is no vodka.
All right. Well, luckily, I poured a double.
Good man.
This is Polish vodka in honor of our first story and, just Poland generally, and a little tonic.
Drinking for two. I appreciate it.
Never let it be said I didn't do the least I could do for the show. So, without further ado, let's just get right to the stories. I want to talk about Ukraine and Russia and nuclear weapons at the end, but let's tell the stories first. And this time, folks, we have a combo. We have a story from the OG, Lessons from History, and we have a story from More Lessons of History, and also a first on our podcast. I'm not going to make a joke about the title.
All right.
Alex, I love the fact that we're finally getting to this story from the OG because it has a personal connection for you.
It does. We talk about family a lot on the podcast, and my grandfather was a glider pilot at Arnhem. So I've always taken an interest in paratroopers. Famously, of course, the Bridge Too Far, the movie, our forces were captured in a bit of overreach. And the first Allied parachute drop in enemy territory was called Operation Colossus. It was in early 1941. And that was a raid carried out in Italy by British commandos, and it was a unit that became the Special Air Service, the SAS. And that was a very mixed bag, Brian. Successfully tested the concept that such missions could be done, but the aqueduct that they had targeted was harmed, but it was very swiftly repaired, and they were all caught by the Italians. So no enormous success. But 1 week later, which is what I want to talk about, there was a much more significant raid, and it was the first by many by the unit concerned, along with their colleagues in Special Operations Executive at SOE from the UK. And this was not carried out by the British. The Chicka were Polish paratroopers.
Well said.
Thank you very much. Well, I've had a bit of practice because I'm from East Anglia, which is the east of England, which is where they trained. Chicka means the silent and unseen, and they trained in exile in England in a place called Audley End, and it's a beautiful stately home in Essex, which is the county to the south of where I'm from in Suffolk. And there's a nearby railway station called Audley End named after it. And people go past it on the train all the time, not knowing what this place means and the history that it has. And in the beautiful... Until today. And in the beautiful manicured grounds of this stately home, these Polish guys trained, night maneuvers, silent assassination, creeping up on sentries and so forth. And occasionally they had forays beyond their stately home in the local area. One, which I enjoy thinking about, was a mock raid on the train station. So for those who are listening who know what I'm talking about, you can think about that when you pass through it. And another was a full-blown attack exercise on the local post office, which must have put the fear of God into Mrs. Goggins or whoever was manning the post office.
Okay, let me just stop you right there because I made a note to ask you this. Mrs. Goggins, is this a thing in the UK or is this a random name you made up?
No. Is it a thing in the UK? Mrs. Goggins is a profound figure of cultural relevance in the UK. Mrs. Goggins is a central figure in Postman Pat, which is a cartoon in the UK. Soon, I'm sure, to be renamed Postperson Pat. But for the time being, Postman Pat remains, and Mrs. Goggins is one of his luminaries in the postal delivery world.
Well, I can tell you, as our listeners know, I'm not particularly cultured, but I will tell you, I doubt 10 Americans would be able to identify Mrs. Goggins or even know what it referred to. Now I have to ask, is Postman Pat more or less popular than Smokey Stover?
Oh, much more. Much more. But I like to much more popular in the UK, at least. Mrs. Goggins and Postman Pat are central figures from many English childhoods, including my own. But the point is, of course, neither snow nor rain, nor heat nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds, even raids of Polish paratroopers. They also did some night maneuvers around Audley End, which led to punch-ups with both the Essex Police and units from the Old Home Guard, which is a very good reference, by the way, to a TV show in the UK called Dad's Army, which played for I think it played for longer than the Second World War. Certainly, like MASH played longer than the Korean War. And if it wasn't created and played for longer than the Second World War, it certainly had repeats for decades longer than the Second World War. Anyway, so all of these guys must have been surprised by these Poles charging around their patch. Anyway, their historic first drop, which is what I wanted to talk about, was a raid behind enemy lines in their beloved Polish homeland, which was, of course, occupied by the Germans on the night of the 15th to 16th of February, 1941. 3 agents were returned to Poland after a 5.5-hour flight from RAF Stradishall, which is just a little bit to the south of my native Bury St Edmunds. By the way, that site at Stradishall is now occupied by 2 prisons, High Point North, or used to be called the High Point Hotel, and High Point South, which held George Michael as an inmate. And interesting, it was the musician, and High Point North, which was a woman's prison, and then was made a mixed prison, also had Boy George briefly as an inmate. So these are
apparently he could have been an inmate in either iteration.
Well, that's danger zone talking, and how dare you assume a gender either way, I suppose.
Address your cards and letters to Alex Deane, everybody.
As we are discussing this, we just saw the immolation of a political leader in my country. The long-standing leader of the Scottish National Party, Nicola Sturgeon, decided to take her party, which was created to realise independence for her country, and die on the hill of trying to send a male rapist to a female prison. So anyway, that wasn't what I wanted to get in on, but that was that occurred to me as we were discussing these what happened to RAF Stradishall. Anyway, so they take off from RAF Stradishall and they fly to Poland. Not an ideal first attempt. They were dropped 30 miles from the intended drop site. That is not precision flying. Still, a man, and my pronunciation may be off here, called Arkady Rezogski, who was the Polish ambassador to the UK when I wrote my first book. He said that the Chickachemny's first mission offered a glimmer of hope to the besieged homeland that help was coming. And I take pride in that as someone from East Anglia. And over the years, the Chickachemny delivered funds and material to the resistance, and they became officers in the Polish secret army. And they taught others the guerrilla warfare lessons that they had been taught at Audley End. And they also conveyed, so they were delivering agents to be embedded in the underground movement. These guys were all volunteers, Brian. And Britain is proud to have trained them in covert operations, cryptography, intelligence gathering, sabotage, and of course our national pastime of queuing. So some 316 Chickachemny were dropped from Britain into occupied Poland between 1941 and 1945. Over 100 died in combat or were executed after being captured by the Germans, and 18 more died in action during the Warsaw Uprising, which was a noble endeavor. Those raids stopped in 1944 after most of Poland was occupied by the Red Army. And I think a grim indication of the future that awaited Poland was given by the fact that in addition to those killed by the Nazis, 9 further Chickachemny were executed after the war by the communist regime that was established by the Russians in Poland. But all in all, some 527 Polish warriors completed their special training at Audley End House, and they were heroes all. This sedate spot in rural Essex, in my country, in the words of English heritage, was the spiritual home of wartime resistance to the Poles, and that is why I told their story.
Yeah, it's quite a thing for your country. Thank you for doing that. And it does make me wonder, if this podcast will help East Anglia become better known for this than Leatherface or whoever that guy is that's in Bury St. Edmunds. What do you call that guy?
Yes, you're talking about I touched the Bible bound in the skin of William Cawdor.
That's
and
it.
Leatherface is not what I called him, but I also saw his death mask, which was a once common tradition. You took a cast from someone's body after they died, but Cawdor's body, which was flayed after he died, it was skinned after he died. They took some of the skin and made it into a Bible, and I'm pretty sure it's not our imagination that we touched it. I think we did. The 1980s may feel impossibly long ago to some of our younger listeners, and to you and I, it may feel like yesterday. But yes, let us hope that the Chickachemney become better known than William Cawdor's flesh-bound Bible.
Yeah, well, we did our part, and you did your part in the book. Of course, the other historical reference I have to raise, and the first thing they teach you in law school is don't ask a question you don't already know the answer to. But the character that Gene Hackman played in A Bridge Too Far, whose name I cannot pronounce, but very, very highly decorated Polish general who went on that raid. Was he part of any of this? Was he around? Do you know during this?
That's a really good question. I don't know. Like a lot of people who'd been in the war, my grandfather didn't talk about any of his experience, so I didn't have until right at the end when he was I wasn't with him for his last weeks, but apparently he was interested in talking about his time then. But I corresponded with the internet is a wonderful thing. Social media comes in for a real bad rep, I think, an unjustified one in many ways, because it enables people to be connected in ways they wouldn't otherwise be. And I got in touch with a guy who's a real enthusiast for the history of the Allies at Arnhem, who lives in that part of the world. And he has made it his life's mission to maintain records of those who served and were captured at Arnhem and so forth. And he sent me the most remarkable transcripts of the accounts of my grandfather's capture, which were made by the Germans, up to and including my grandfather's signing out papers that he had no complaints about the way he'd been treated by the Germans as a POW. You better believe that's what you bloody said on the form. So I don't put any credence, but I know my grandfather's handwriting, and I know because I've got a piece of a letter from him on my wall. I know for a fact that's what it was. It wasn't some internet scam or something. This guy didn't want anything from me anyway. He just was sharing he had photos of my grandfather, so it really wasn't a scam. He just made it his life's mission, and he had an account from the regimental write-up and from the German accounts of how my grandfather was captured in a church, and they had a shootout in the church, which recalled for me a number of movies, not least The Eagle Has Landed, when there's a famous kind of shootout in a rural church in England. Anyway, and that passage of the time in Arnhem was something my grandfather never talked about. He it came to me afterwards that many of the people on the march with him to concentration camps that he was in, prisoner of war camps. And by the way, those two things were mixed in the course of the Second World War. The Germans didn't have enough soldiers properly to guard those who were going, so they brutalized every other man in order to make sure that the other person had to carry his mate, so as to slow the column down. And I'm afraid my grandfather had no visible injuries by the time that I knew him in the 1980s, but of course there's a long time afterwards, and I don't know whether he was the unbrutalized or the brutalized.
Wow. That's powerful.
So that's how little I know from my grandfather about the time of the Second World War. He then, when he sent me his wings that he'd worn throughout his service, he wrote the dates and units in which he'd served, and that's about all I got.
Wow. Well, I don't know if it's too personal, but I'm sure our viewers and listeners would love to see some of that documentation if you're willing and able to put it in the show notes.
You hold on there 1 second. I'm going to hold it up to the camera. 1 second.
Perfect. And while we're doing that, I will simply remind everyone of a point that we made in the last episode from another story of Alex's, which is the meticulous record keeping of the Nazi regime. And so I'm wondering if they even recorded their own brutalization. I wouldn't be surprised.
Right. So here I am, and you probably can't, of course, for anyone listening, you can't see it. We'll put it in the show notes. I got a framed copy of it's my grandfather's wings, and his, this is, I've got his association, POW association badge, and a couple of the jacket, the insignia he was entitled to wear. To my shame, there's a couple of others of these that are still in my mother's home that I didn't have, so I could frame them. And very spindly writing, and it's a little faded by time. But his letter to me saying, "These are the wings of the Army Air Corps, of which the Glider Pilot Regiment were part." And then he gives the dates and units he served in below that. Here. So I very happy to honor his memory.
Yeah, that's that's remarkable. So I take it you were close with him, at least for some period of time?
I was very young. My mother was the youngest of four, and he had, as a lot of veterans did, he had his children relatively old. So he died in my early teens, and I think I was one of the grandchildren that he saw more. I've got some wonderful cousins, and no slights on them, but I was one of the grandchildren he saw more, and I was one of them that showed an interest. And also, I was a boy, and there are certain, it's not perhaps it's crass and it's old fashioned, but some people feel that connection. I played with soldiers, and there was an obvious thing that I was more interested, I suppose. Perhaps he picked up on my early and nascent love of history. Perhaps he helped foster it.
Well, that's my next question. Yeah. Can you draw a line from learning about your grandfather and actually being able to touch the artifacts and your enthusiastic amateur historian status?
Well, that's a great question. So my another thing that very often happened, I think only exceeded by astronauts in percentage terms. Like many veterans, my grandfather got divorced and remarried, and so I had two grandfathers on my mother's side. The one I grew up knowing married to my grandmother, and my blood grandfather who married a wonderful woman who died only very recently. And so my other grandfather on my mother's side, my mother's stepfather, was in the artillery, and he was perfectly willing to talk about things. I just was a bit too ignorant to have asked at the time when he died. And my father's father died before I was born, and he was the most senior of the lot. He was a major, and he took the surrender of a whole bunch of Italians, which on one mocking view might not be that hard, but took almost single-handed, took some bravery at the time when you see a long column of Italians coming at you across the North African desert. Turned out they were actually looking for somebody to surrender to. So when he charged up to them, he was on a good innings, but he wasn't to know that at the time. My grandfather on my father's side was a career soldier. He wasn't a volunteer. He was a lifelong infantryman, and so that was different. But so it's sort of, the interest is in my blood, I suppose. But of the three, that's my grandfather's wings from Arnhem are the things I really, I look at it every day.
Of course, yeah. And I've seen that in your home, but I guess I didn't go and read the history of it. I didn't realize what it was. That's amazing. Well, this kind of heroism and also the training that the OSE gave to the Poles. And by the way, for our American listeners and viewers, the Office of Special Executive, I would argue, Alex, is akin to the Office of Strategic Services in the United States during World War II, which became the Central Intelligence Agency, which is, my career. So I have a certain fondness for that. But it's clear, I don't have any classified information. I wouldn't talk about it if I did, but it's clear that probably your government and my government have spent a lot of time and energy teaching the Ukrainians how to resist and how to fight and how to do all the unsavory things.
And also have provided intelligence that have assisted the Ukrainians in targeting and identifying Russian assets.
And cheers to us.
Cheers.
And your government. And in fact, the company that you and I both work with, that was the circumstance, a happy circumstance that we met, is in there supporting the fight too. So that's all good. I want to talk though, as we sit here, I guess 13 months after the Russian invasion. You know, we talked about this a lot early on, have gotten away from it a little bit as things sort of ground to a stalemate. But what's happened most recently, two things I guess I want to just mention before we get to our next two stories. By the way, everybody, a 3 for today, 3 stories for the price of 1. One, Alex, is this remarkable resistance in Bakhmut. I mean,
yeah,
I might have this slightly wrong, but I'm pretty sure the Russians have been about to take Bakhmut since November. And most Western military authorities say there's not a lot of strategic significance to that, but boy, they're holding out. It's got to be a huge blow to Putin.
It's amazing, and it happens all the time in the history of conflict, that a place that people think is going to be a real tough nut folds quickly, and a place that is almost nowhere on a map that people think is just going to get rolled over turns out, by whatever reason, by dint of leadership, by dint of preparation, by dint of material in the right place at the right time, by dint of a combination of these things, to be a real sticking point for an invasion force. And you're talking about, boy, are you talking about one of them?
Yeah. Well, now that you mentioned the ones that fall surprisingly easily, I have to make a callback to our very first episode where we talked about Fort Budge Budge.
Yes.
Taken down by a single able seaman, as I recall.
Well, single able seaman to start with. He was lucky that some of his mates came along and gave him a hand, not least because he dinged his sword very quickly, probably on the earthworks of the fort concerned. But yeah, that's a good callback.
And while we're shamelessly trying to get people to listen again to our pilot episode from, I believe, February of 2022.
That's every year, yeah.
It contains the opposite. Your people and the Native Americans thought they were going to crush little Fort Stevenson in my hometown. And our intrepid band with one cannon, held them off. Perhaps changed the course of the war.
Albeit in hindsight, your resistance of Native Americans is just a naked sign of your bigotry. So really, you should have folded the British, shouldn't you?
Well, not mine personally, I hope you're saying.
No, I'm your general. Yes, fair enough. I was only joking, obviously joking in the first place.
Here's the other thing I want to talk about as we sit here in mid-March of 2023. Once again, Vladimir Putin has pushed the nuclear threat button by saying that he plans to deploy tactical nuclear weapons to Belarus, which, of course, is the neighbor of Ukraine and Poland. So it's adjacent to NATO territory. And it sounds like a bad news story. And if it actually happens, it is a bad news story. But it's a pattern now with him. He only makes these kinds of apocalyptic threats when he's really losing. So I don't know. I think might be a good news story.
Well, I hope you're right. I do note, though, that his proxies make these wild threats rather more often. And so it's a very tightly controlled media environment out of Russia, obviously.
Yeah.
And Medvedev, who people will recall, was prime minister, then was the patsy president for a while, then nominated Putin to come back. And he was clearly just keeping the seat warm for Putin whilst they ironed out their constitution so Putin could be president for life. Medvedev, who's still got a kind of a role, I think he's deputy secretary to the Security Council. But anyway, he's a Putin water carrier. That's his role. Has been out there talking about nuclear weapons for some time, and not just once. So there's no way that Medvedev makes comments without the approval of the Putin regime, the Kremlin. That's his whole purpose and existence. So Putin's been trying to make this point for some time through his proxies, and maybe he just feels like it hasn't come across yet. So he's now making it more directly. We've talked about it before on the podcast. The Soviets are the only people who ever had nuclear weapons in their order of battle. That is to say, in conventional warfare.
Yes.
And the Russians have inherited that order of battle. It's never been disowned. So I fear that I take these things rather more seriously than some people who think it's just spear shaking and sword rattling. Saber rattling. I mean, after all, there are those, and I kind of fall in this camp. I thought Putin wasn't going to be so stupid as to invade in the first place. You find very few people willing to admit now that they were wrong over a year ago. I was one of them.
I was not one of them.
No, you were right on that. That's correct. You were right on that, and I was wrong.
I will say that, well, first of all, you're 100% right. Soviet military doctrine, which Russia has inherited, is they do not draw the line between conventional weapons and weapons of mass
No,
destruction.
they were the only power that ever did that.
And to be clear, I'm not trying to downplay the risk that Putin would be, on one definition, insane enough to use tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine. I think when we had Mary Beth Long on a year ago, I put the risk at somewhere north of 10%, and she, who was a assistant secretary of defense and career CIA officer, put it more like in the 20s. So I agree, it's a serious risk. I'm not downplaying. All I'm saying is, I haven't gone back and precisely researched this, but I think the moments where Putin himself has talked about it tend to coincide with times when he's getting very seriously beaten on the battlefield.
It's a very interesting theory. Hopefully there's a scholar out there listening to us who's going to take up the Cunningham theory.
Well, now that we're on the topic of modern military affairs, let's talk about Mad Dog Mattis from
great story
from history.
Not least, say your President Trump had already used that that nickname in social media before he actually met Jim Mattis. And then he asked Mattis, do the troops actually call you Mad Dog? This is in the course of him nominating Jim Mattis to the cabinet. And Mattis said, no, sir, I'm called Chaos. And I love I love the notion of President Trump being lost for words. President Trump sort of asked, why is that? And it turns out Colonel has another outstanding suggestion.
Which is not a compliment.
No, correct. Chaos had stuck with Mattis ever since he was a relatively junior officer. So he was a lifelong Marine Corps man and was, of course, your Secretary of Defense. And the story about him I'm going to tell comes to us from the former commandant of the Marine Corps, General Krulak, which he told in part to make a story about how cool he is himself. Yeah. But we're going to forgive him that.
Nice West Wing callback, by the way.
Much obliged. Yes, indeed. That is exactly what I was doing when I wrote it. It's President Bartlett. It's a story about how cool I am. But we'll forgive Krulak that in the circumstances. Christmas Day each year, Krulak would drive around the lonely Marine guard posts in the greater Washington, D.C. area. And he would give some cookies and fellowship to the poor souls who'd pulled guard duty amongst the Marines that day. One such occasion, he stopped at Quantico. Brian, you want to tell people what Quantico is?
Most people think of Quantico as an FBI facility because it's been used in TV shows, but Quantico is a main headquarters for the United States Marine Corps, also in Virginia.
And Krulak meets a lance corporal at the gate, and he asks, who's the officer of the day? And the lance corporal says, sir, it's Brigadier General Mattis. Krulak says, no, I know General Mattis. Who is the officer on duty today, Christmas Day? And the lance corporal says, it really is Brigadier General Mattis. And Krulak barges in and points to the cot at the back of the guard post and says, right, son, which officer slept there on Christmas Eve? The lance corporal says, sir, it was Brigadier General Mattis. And saving Krulak a popped vein and the lance corporal a world of pain, Jim Mattis walked in at that moment in his duty uniform. And Krulak said, Jim, it's Christmas Day. What are you doing here? Mattis said, well, the young man who was on the roster as duty officer for today has a young family, and I thought he should spend Christmas Day with them. So I put myself down for the Christmas Day shift instead. So Mattis cared about those under his command, and he led by actions that showed that, not with fine words, but with orders. And of course, the same is true of Krulak, because it took both of them to be there at an obscure guard post one Christmas Day morning to know that moment had happened at all. And as one veteran of our forces and now member of Parliament, in tweeting my story, said succinctly, leadership is service.
Yeah. Lead by example. Yeah. Well, you probably recall, Alex, that our guest I just mentioned a minute ago, Mary Beth Long, she's quite close with General Mattis. I have
is that right?
Passing acquaintance with him. She's very close to him, and she has said to me that he is, in public and in private, one of the greatest leaders that she's ever seen,
So I'll give you two. I'll
which
give
is
you
saying
my
something.
yeah. Well, she's seen a lot, right? So I'll give you my two favorite Mattis quotes. First favorite Mattis quote: "Be polite, be professional, have a plan to kill everybody you meet." I I just think that's a very sobering thought that anyone who meets someone whose job is war fighting, whose job is to combat the king's enemies in my case and to defeat them, kinetic action has all manner of euphemisms, but you're meeting this person, they're polite and they're professional, but they've got a plan to kill you.
I live by at least one of those three.
Yeah, okay. I'm certainly not going to pin you down which. And my second Jim Mattis quote is, "PowerPoint makes us stupid." Now, you think about some of those presentations that were put up during Afghanistan and during the conflict there, and think about what we do in corporate life with PowerPoint. I think it's quite a short phrases quite often convey deep, profound meanings. PowerPoint makes us stupid.
Yeah, it's true. I've evolved my PowerPoint style a lot over the years, and when I use it at all, it has nothing. First of all, it's like 5 slides or less, and it just has images. There's no words ever. It's just it's the process makes you stupid. You can't say it better than that. So let me ask you this, Alex. So we in public and private have disagreed a bit on our analysis of President Trump. And of course, Mattis served as Secretary of Defense under President Trump. I doubt we would disagree on this, that it must have been, not that the job of Secretary of Defense is not always extremely difficult, and not that we haven't had more colorful presidents as well, but had to be pretty hard under President Trump, because you basically, the way, and I think about this about CIA chiefs of station and ambassadors as well. You're pretty much improvising all day, every day, based on the latest tweet.
So on the one hand, I agree with that, of course. Unpredictability in the chain of command is in and of itself a major issue and problem. And certainty in leadership is a vastly underrated quality. Knowing where your boss is going is at least as important as confidence that they've made the right decision day to day.
Yeah, very famous aphorism is, a good decision today is much better than an excellent decision 6 months from now.
Yeah, correct. And changing your mind presents all manner of challenges and problems for those serving under you. And I take that point. On the other hand, I can't help but think that it's more difficult being Secretary of Defense when Russia has launched a land war than when they haven't. And they didn't during President Trump's regime, and therefore I question your thesis.
So I always want to try to not exceed our West Wing quota per episode, but I will simply quote to you the title of episode 2 or 3 of the West Wing, which is "Post hoc ergo propter hoc," and our listeners can figure out what I mean by that, probably.
Yeah, but it's not. Well, that may hold up that it's after it, therefore because of it. But it was during it is the point about 4 years of President Trump's time in the White House that Russia didn't invade anyone. And of course, it's not a partisan political issue, because it was under President Bush that the Russians invaded Georgia, and then it was under President Obama that they invaded Crimea, and then you had the Trump interregnum, and then under President Biden, the Russians invaded Ukraine wholesale. And it's not after it, therefore, because of it. It was during that 4 years is the point I'm noting. So you can. It's not even a wider point. Your question was just about whether it was easier or harder to be Secretary of State for Defense. I surmise that it was easier for President Trump's Secretary of State for Defense, Secretaries of Defense, to operate in their parameters than it was for their predecessors and successors, either side of that time when Russia launched no land war. That's all I comment.
Yeah. I mean, point well taken. I guess part of it depends on what you think of as making a job hard, right? So, a guy like Jim Mattis, who was a career Marine general and then the Secretary of Defense, his entire life is dedicated to deterring a war, and if you can't deter it, fighting it. So is his job harder when he's directing an active conflict? I don't know. I don't know about that.
It's a fair question. I mean, yes, your job is to prosecute military endeavors, and here is one in front of you. So go at it. I take the point, but on the other hand, facing a nuclear power in a proxy war, people may not like the term, people may not like the comparison, but it's, I'm convinced that those entrusted with our safety during the Cold War had as hard a job as those who fought hot wars. And not least because you had perennially to be ready. And this may, of course, support your point, because those under President Trump had to switch and change their plans all the time, depending on the presidential whim or sense of direction. But my goodness, those concerned with Russia's aggression in the post-Soviet, post-capitalist experiment in Russia, when they reverted to, big man history under dictator Putin. I know they have elections, but let's not kid ourselves, they're real.
No. Usually there's 99% turnout. Imagine that.
Indeed. So my point, I suppose, would be that I think it's just got to be a little easier when the Russians haven't actually invaded somebody in your watch.
Yeah, fair. Well, in any event, I think we can agree that Jim Mattis is not just an American hero, but a leadership role model around the globe.
As Johnny Mercer, as Johnny Mercer tweeted when I told that story, leadership is service.
And cheers to both of our defense establishments. Slava Ukraine.
Slava Ukraine.
All right, enough of that.
The correct toast response is to the heroes of Ukraine, and I can't remember what the words are, but whatever that is.
Well, you meant to say the right thing. You were well intentioned. So now let's transition to someone I think we would both agree, although we've never chatted about it, is a true global hero. And that is Dwight Eisenhower.
I couldn't agree more. Eisenhower graduated from West Point and was commissioned second lieutenant, as we would call it, in 1915. Promoted first lieutenant in 1916 as the First World War threatened to draw your country into conflict. And the month after America entered the First World War in 1917, he was promoted to captain, then to major, and then to lieutenant colonel. And those last two were both as temporary ranks in 1918. And he reverted to his permanent rank of captain in 1920. So he was a lieutenant colonel, bumped down again 2 ranks in 1920. And
let me just, sorry to interrupt, but let me just say for our listeners and viewers who are not steeped in the military hierarchy, that's a big deal. Right. That is essentially, it'd be roughly it'd be roughly like going from a division chief in a big company, sub C-suite, to being like a program manager. It's a huge change.
Correct. So he goes end of 1917, he's promoted to captain. 1918, you're a major, you're a lieutenant colonel. The war ends. 1920, he holds the temporary rank for 2 more years. 1920, back down to captain. And then, this is remarkable, back up to major a few weeks after being bumped down. But he stays as major for 16 years.
Unbelievable.
After that.
After putting his life on the line.
1936, he becomes a lieutenant colonel again, a rank he had held 2 decades prior. And there were no guarantees he would ever see full colonel. And most people's evaluation would honestly and frankly have been little prospect of going past that. Indeed, he was still a lieutenant colonel in 1941, some 5 years later. Second World War started, 1939.
Yeah.
Still a lieutenant colonel in 1941. Nobody looks at that record and predicts he's going to that's the groundwork for a man who will become a full general in 2 years, who will go on to become supreme commander of Allied forces and become a beloved 2-term president of your country. But the war came, history called, and Eisenhower, by dint of a lifetime of unglamorous preparation, was ready. Bear in mind, commissioned 1915, still a lieutenant colonel 1941. And the meteoric rise after that to command all Allied forces in Europe.
Let me just point out a fact without comment one way or the other. as I understand the modern rules of the U.S. military, he could not have held that rank for that long. He would have been out. So I'm not sure whether we've got it right at this point.
Because you've got an up or out
Up or
structure,
out,
right?
Yeah.
That may, of course, everybody's armed forces. I say everybody in the West's armed forces were larger then than they are now. But you've probably got a point. The lesson for me from this remarkable example of personal success is, I suppose, obvious, but there are lulls and becalmed times in one's career. One mustn't be disheartened. Keep going.
I think that's an important lesson. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No. That's it's one of the if he said it, I said it modestly. It's one of the best lessons I think I've got in my books. The example of Eisenhower. Everyone remembers how he ended his career. No one remembers the 2 decades in the backwater before that. It's not even like Churchill was in and then out and had a wilderness period and then back in. Eisenhower had a full-blown backwater 2 decades before he made it.
And real backwater. Like even a lieutenant colonel in the United States military is not at anything close to a policy level, much less a, command and future president level.
That is a junior officer.
Yeah. And it reminds me of probably the only thing you'll ever hear me say favorably about Kevin McCarthy, which is in his acceptance speech after he was finally elected Speaker of our House of Representatives. He quoted his father or his grandfather, I think his father, who said, "Kevin, it doesn't matter where you start, it matters where you end up," because he had just gone through 19 ballots or whatever it was to get there. And it's kind of the same with Eisenhower. I also can't help but remind everyone that my grandparents wrote to President Eisenhower in the 50s and asked him to recognize the existence of UFOs. But we'll forgive him that. He had an amazing life and career notwithstanding.
I have only I've met properly once with we had dinner once. I had dinner with Kevin McCarthy, and I would tell you this from I met him over the course of a day or so, and we sat down at dinner. There is not an ounce of malice in that man, and what you see is what you get in the kind of pragmatic guy trying to do his best. Now, he may fall long way short of your idea of an ideal politician, but I'm telling you, with no malice in him, that's a great deal better than you can say of a number of political figures of this day.
It's true, and a number of Democrats in our country are not also without malice. I will say, I've never met the man, so you've already got a one up on me. He certainly comes across always or almost always as a happy warrior, and I believe it's easy for me to believe that he doesn't have personal malice. I will say this, though. We have a big dispute in our country about the status of Donald Trump, and you and I have a big dispute between each other about the goodness versus badness of Donald Trump. McCarthy had a moment when Trump was on the mat and could have probably been easily put into the ash bin of history of U.S. politics after his second impeachment. And McCarthy went to Mar-a-Lago after having publicly excoriated Trump for his role in the January insurrection in our country. Then he went down and resurrected him. And my observation of it is, I don't think Kevin McCarthy thought the January 6th was a good day. I think he just nakedly wanted power, and he was going to do whatever he could to get it. And that's not entirely inconsistent with not having malice, but it's a killer for me. It's I can't support the guy.
Well, there's a very big gap between the events you're describing and him becoming speaker, just in terms of timing.
Oh, that's true.
Yeah,
that's true.
And I don't think anyone would have looked at that and thought that was the bet. And of course, when President Trump did endorse Kevin McCarthy to be speaker, it was on the most milquetoast of bases. It was, be careful what you wish for. If you wish for the extreme, sometimes you get the far more liberal outcome as a result. It's not exactly a full-throated endorsement, but your point's well made, and all I can think about in that is that people can do things that they think are the right thing, whilst also being seen as being self-serving, not least seeking, without having any particular insight into the example we're discussing, wishing to hold together their political party and trying to hold together different wings of their political movement, so that they don't reach points of irreconcilable difference. Hey, I wanted to give you one more Eisenhower anecdote.
Yes, please.
Vichy France. People always forget the extent of collaboration in France, and Vichy France extended the anti-Semitic laws that they had from the Germans to their French colonies in North Africa. So suddenly, North African colonies had these anti-Jewish provisions, and when Eisenhower and his troops in Africa marching up and liberating the French colonies came there, it fell to them to undo the wrongs that had been done by the Vichy French regime. And the detractors of what they were doing as they went about restoring property or putting in place civil courts or putting back in place civil authorities so that they could oversee reconstruction, their detractors who had done well under the Vichy regime put it about that Eisenhower and his family were Jewish. They were in fact Pennsylvania Dutch. But anyway, Eisenhower therefore became fond of telling his friends a story that his brother Milton, incredible family, his brother Milton was a very senior civil servant under Roosevelt and Truman. And Milton told Ike that he'd been at this dinner party, and the dowager hostess had turned to him at the appropriate point in the dinner when you talk to the person on your right and said, "Hey, Milton, you're so successful. You're one of our leading civil servants. You've got a brother who runs one of our most esteemed banks. And of course, you've got a brother in Europe or Africa leading our troops. What a pity you, Eisenhower's, are Jewish." And Ike used to love telling how his brother, Eisenhower, Milton, put on this mournful face and sighed unhappily and said, "Ah, madam, what a pity it is we aren't."
That is not only great, it's almost Churchillian. I can't pull a quote out of my head fast enough, but you'll know it. Something about if you were a lady, I'd let you. What is that? What is that?
Yes, that's
Churchill
actually
quote?
It's George Bernard Shaw. Actually, so I think
Oh.
a woman said to George Bernard Shaw, if you were my husband, I'd put poison in your tea, and he said, if you were my wife, I'd drink it.
Right.
It's off. I think it's sometimes it may actually be a Churchillism, but I think it's often ascribed to Churchill. But in my mind, I think it's George Bernard Shaw. Certainly, it's George Bernard Shaw who said to a woman, would you, it's pointed across the room to a kind of matinee idol of the day and said, "Would you sleep with him for £1,000?" And this woman said, "Well, I might." And he said, "Well, would you sleep with me for sixpence?" And she said, "What do you take me for?" And he said, "We've already established what you are. I'm just trying to negotiate the fee."
That is, it's funny you mentioned that, because my father, who was an Episcopal minister and probably didn't have that great a sense of humor and certainly never showed it to us, he has a version of that story, and I can never remember anything but the punchline, which is, "Well, now that's settled. We're just negotiating." So that now I know what that is. So
that's George Bernard
Shaw.
Yeah.
So we're going to let everybody have 10 minutes back of their hour, but a couple of plugs I want to make. One is, please go back and watch our live episode from London. It's I had an amazing time doing it. I know you did too. Please go to High Timber and have the what is it? The Alex Deane salad.
Yep, I got a salad named after me. Look, if you're going to choose a dish, choose one a lot of people order.
And the Jordan Chardonnay. Yeah,
that's delicious. Absolutely delicious.
Please
they look after us so well.
I have another plug, and although, Alex, you were severely missed last week, I really enjoyed my conversation with Michael Dennett at UC Irvine. I bought his book, Divine Science, Finding Reason at the Heart of Faith.
That looks a very interesting read.
It's really good. I guess probably our listeners have gathered that, I've got ministers in my family, I've got UFOs in my family, and I've for decades thought about this issue of, how much science and faith relate to each other and how compatible they are. That's a great.
Give us the title again. Divine Science.
We'll put it in the show notes, but it's Divine Science.
Finding Reason at the Heart of Faith.
Yeah.
Thank you, bro.
So Denon is a physicist, and he's also a religious person. Anyway, so it's very, very good. Now, notwithstanding my boisterous statements in London that was our 48th episode, it was not.
No.
Last week was our 48th episode, which means this is our 49th episode, which means, Alex, we're coming up on 50 episodes of the Hidden History Happy Hour.
Half century coming up.
Cheers.
Cheers.
So, viewers and listeners, we're going to put out a poll. We're going to do a retrospective of year one of the first 50 episodes, and we want to know what you think are your favorites, and we're going to talk about those, and we'll probably slide in a news story also, which leads me to my last topic, Alex. How is Volume 3 going?
Well, you were putting in plugs. I would like some recommendations for stories. I just put up a story about the Samnites, who were opponents of the Romans for good long time before they went the way of the traditional Roman opponent during Rome's prime, which was oblivion. Right. But it's got some good lessons in it. No half measures being a real lesson from that story, and actually to the topics we've been discussing, listen to your father being another. But so I did what he said immodestly is a good story this week. But I welcome topics. Volume 3 is coming on a pace.
Well, that is great. Good to know. I hope I'll have a few things to contribute to it. I hope we can have some more UFO stories that we can get Mr. Deane to comment on. We always love talking about unexplained phenomenon. Also, absolutely. I want to hear more stories from children who had to encounter grotesque artifacts at their local museum.
There's got to be more out there than me.
I just had all I had to do was go look at a canon. You had to touch a leather-bound Bible.
But the thing is, you say had to. When you're that age, when you're 7 or 8, and someone says to you, "Do you want to touch this Bible bound in human flesh?" There's not much holding you back. It
is true. It is true. Well, on that grisly note, let's call it a day, Alex. I look forward to next time.
Thank you, brother.
Thanks, everybody.
Cheers.
Cheers.